Well, hello and welcome to this Euractiv virtual conference titled CAP Reform, Is Social Conditionality the Answer for Workers? My name is Julia Dahm. I'm an agri-food journalist at Euractiv, and I have the pleasure to be moderating today. And over 10 million people are employed in the agriculture sector across Europe. But many of them are in informal employment, many are migrant workers, and there frequently are reports of poor working conditions or poor wages. So to tackle this situation, the EU has, for the first time, incorporated a social pillar into its reformed Common Agricultural Policy, also known as CAP, which came into force this year. And the way this works is that farmers are required to comply with a set of minimum standards, social and labor standards. And if these are not met by a farm, national authorities can decide to withhold a portion of that farm's CAP subsidies. And currently, it's still voluntary for EU countries to implement this. And so far, only France, Italy, and Austria have opted to introduce social conditionality at this point. But it will be mandatory for EU member states by 2025. So is social conditionality the right approach for the EU to guarantee fair working standards in agriculture? And how can we make sure it works in practice? These are some of the questions we want to discuss with our panelists today. So let's welcome our panel, which includes Margaret Bateson-Missen, Head of Social Sustainability at the European Commission's DG Agri. Next up, we have Piroska Kelly. She's the President of the Permanent Group on Sustainable Food Systems at the European Economic and Social Committee. We have with us Claudia Merlingo. She's our representative from the employers side today. She's the Vice President of the Employers Group of Professional Agricultural Organizations in the EU, GIOPA COPE for short, and she's also the head of the economic department at the Italian Agriculture Confederation, GIA Agricoltori Italiani. And we have with us also Mary Angels Fortuny. She's the head of unit at Forestry, Agriculture, Construction, and Tourism Unit of the International Labour Organization. And last but not least, we have Christian Bragerson to bring us the union's perspective today. He's the Secretary General of the European Federation of Food, Agriculture and Tourism Trade Unions. So I think we've heard enough from me. Let's jump right into it and hear directly from our panelists. So I'd like to do a short round of intro statements, starting with you, maybe Margaret. So if you could give us your introductory remarks.
Well, good morning, everyone. And Julia, you've already introduced what the social conditionality mechanism is. I have to say it was a very important step that the CAP took in 2021 by including the rights of the agricultural workers into the CAP. I have to say, until then, I was always very relieved when a question arrived on workers' conditions, as the CAP had no competence in that area and it had very few provisions that could be used to improve conditions. And while that competence for the legislation, the social legislation still remains with DG Employment, we now have some tools in the CAP to address workers' rights. So I will later on, I'm sure I'll tell you about the 3 directives in question. It might not seem like enough, but it's a very important start. Now that the mechanism is there, we can add to it in future CAP reforms, but there are a number of drawbacks. As it applies only to the direct payments to farmers, it doesn't cover horticulture, so fruit and vegetable sector, which receives very few direct payments, and this is where most of the abuses actually exist, especially for the seasonal workers and the informal workers. There are some sectoral interventions, but they're not the same as social conditionality. And the other big drawback is, since social conditionality relies on the existing control systems of the member states for labour and social rules, it's only going to be as good as those systems are. So to answer I think the title of your conference, or the question of your conference, it is not yet the full answer for agriculture workers. It still has some way to go. So I'll leave the rest of my comments until later. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, for a nuanced statement, I'd say. I'm sure we can discuss some of the points you mentioned during the discussion. So Piroska, maybe you can give your introductory remarks next. Yeah, I'm afraid we can't hear you. I don't know if the others can. Maybe you have to unmute yourself somewhere. No, not yet. Maybe we move on to Claudia and we just try with you afterwards to see if it works then. So Claudia, if you're ready, maybe we can just jump to you next.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Julia, and goodbye to everyone. I agree with Margaret. You really touch important topics for farmers also. I would like to make a statement before we start the discussion, and it's not so obvious, but when we talk about compliance with labor legislation and compliance with collective agreements, regulation on safety at work and working hours is first and foremost a matter of priority interest, not only for workers, but only very much for employers. Because whoever does not respect the rules competes unfairly with healthy companies, with healthy farmers that we represent. Then there is an indirect but nonetheless significant damage that employers who do not respect the rules produce, and it is incalculable damage because it affects the reputation of an entire sector. And even if virtuous companies are the majority, and even if the rate of irregularities in our sector is more or less equal to that of other sector without one mention, because it is a challenge that doesn't interest me, the incorrect behavior of a few companies fuels the story of a sixth sector. And the second statement I would like to do is about what it means to be a farmer today. So the agricultural sector is a strategic sector for our future. A precious asset to defend and who demonstrate its ability and centrality during the pandemic when the world war stopped, but not the farmers. So I'm making this statement, which may seem superfluous, only because we all have a great responsibility when we talk about agriculture, and times are difficult. Farmers have clear commitments they have to face: produce more, produce better, produce with less. The complexity of this challenge concerns all of us because food means health, food it means social peace, it means work, it means also justice. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if, okay, I think we're still trying to get to hear Piroska, so maybe let's move on to Mary-Angels first and then we can come back to, I'm sure we can get to hear you. So yeah, let's just move to you, Mary-Angels. Thanks.
Thank you, Julia. And I will start actually with what Claudia was saying. And I bring more the global perspective. I mean, I'm in ILO in headquarters, but I would like first of all to emphasize what a strategic sector this is. Agriculture. Nearly 1/3 of the world population are working in agriculture, and it is the backbone of many developing countries. I was just reading this morning that actually food production needs to increase by 70% by 2050. So food production, it is, and agriculture, it is a very strategic sector. So that's, you know, a very timely discussion that we're having here today. Secondly, that yes, what we call decent work deficits in the sector are pervasive. I mean, particularly in developing countries, agriculture is where the majority of the poor people live. And ironically, those that produce food are those that are most food insecure. Therefore, placing decent work at the center of agro-food systems is very timely, and any initiative that any country or the European Union can do about promoting decent work in the sector is, of course, very much welcome. My third point is about, well, social conditionality reforms of the CAP, and for us, for the ILO, a key to its success. We strongly believe that it's basically the social dialogue that you can have around these measures. that basically, particularly now that we are moving towards the phase of implementation that is voluntary in some countries, how important it is to have tripartite consensus. And in the ILO, when we call tripartite, it means with all the parties, the government, the employers, and the workers. So that's basically really, really key. We believe it's key to move forward in this respect. I also wanted to take the opportunity to sort of a bit advertise, because that topic is so important that we recently had a tripartite meeting to adopt policy guidelines on the promotion of decent work in the agro-food sector. So basically, these policy guidelines have been agreed on a tripartite basis. I mean, it was a difficult discussion because there are very sensitive topics in the guidelines. So we are very happy that we agreed tripartite consensus. They're available online, and basically we hope that they would offer guidance to countries to improve decent work in the sector. And this brings me to a last point that actually is very much emphasized in the guidelines, and our tripartite constituents really emphasized during the discussion, which is about, and I will not now develop long about it, but it's about the respective and complementary roles of all the actors that they have in the process and implementing decent work measures, and basically the importance of the effectiveness and the efficiency of public governance systems, and basically the important role of governments and of public institutions, and the importance of building the capacity of those institutions, and including labor inspection, to implement all the laws and regulations that are needed in the sector. And I will leave it at here. Thank you.
Thank you. And the good news is I think that we have Proska with us sound-wise now, so maybe you can go next.
I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me now?
Yes, now it's perfect. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, and sorry for these technical problems. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. So actually, yes, so very briefly, so I am representing now the European Economic and Social Committee, which is the house of organized civil society, representing employers, trade unions, and other civil society organizations. So actually, we are working not only on social conditionality, but we have long-standing cooperation with EFAT also, and with other institutions. That's why when we are producing our opinions, we often recall for what you have already stated. So actually, as a rapporteur, I've got several experiences on the social conditionality, because I worked on a so-called evaluation on the common agricultural policy's impact on territorial development of rural areas, and I have to say that when we went to engage civil society in different countries to tell their views on social conditionality, mostly, the trade unions and employees side, actually social conditionality had a very good reputation, to be honest. So the most part of them supported social conditionality. Actually, we are working on sustainability issues as well, and we always say that sustainability covers environmental, economic, but also social aspects. As social issues are core for the ESC, the NAT section recently commissioned a study entitled Collecting Data on the Situation of Social Protection of Seasonal Workers in the Agriculture and Food Sectors in EU member states after COVID-19. I'm going to speak about later when it comes to further questions. So briefly, this is my link to the social conditionality issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then last but not least, we have Christian left to give his introductory statement. So please go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for giving EFAT the chance to speak here today, and a chance to highlight the importance of including the social conditionality in the CAP. As we see it, it has a great potential to raise labor standards in one of the most challenging and precarious sectors of the economy. Ensuring that workers' rights was part of CAP was a crucial victory for farm workers and the many responsible employers as well. But it was also an ethically correct outcome. We all agree on that workers' rights are just as important as environmental and animal rights. So for us, social conditionality can be a game changer if it is properly implemented by sanctions and controls. But it must also be highlighted that alone it cannot change everything when it comes to agri-food workers. More is needed, and fortunately the Commission has been taking other steps as well. We must welcome as well the new minimum wage directive, which will also play an important role for the social dialogue within the agriculture sector and can improve working conditions in the sector. We, though, believe that the social conditionality in agriculture is only the beginning. More is needed. The European trade union movement believes no public funds should be given to employers that do not respect workers' rights in general. This is a general rule that should be applied to all EU funds in the future. So, as we see it, not respecting workers' rights should never be rewarded and give companies competitive advantage. And that's why we believe that public funds should go to the many, and I stress the many decent employers that provide decent working conditions and follow the legal frameworks of the member states. Thank you.
Thank you. So a good step, social conditionality, but not the end, you say. Before we jump a bit more into the discussion, I just wanted to go through some housekeeping points. So we do welcome your questions throughout the event. We want it to be very interactive, so don't hesitate to ask your questions all the way throughout the event, not just at the end. We'll incorporate them in the discussion. And the way you do this is you can scan the QR code on the screen, which will lead you to the website Slido. I think many of you probably know it since we're all experienced online conferences by now after the pandemic, but just to go through it again, you can either scan the QR code or you go to slido.com and you type in the code that you can see on the screen, which is #CapReform. And then it brings you to the Slido page where you can ask your questions to the panelists. And I'd ask you to just address your questions, so state which panelists you're asking it to, and also to identify yourself, so give your name and your affiliation as well. We welcome your questions all the way throughout the event, so don't be shy. But for now, let's jump into the discussion. And maybe let's start with a bit of a general question. And I want to ask Christian and Claudia this so that we have a bit the employers and the employees side represented. So maybe Claudia, let's go first with you. Do you think the inclusion of social conditionality in the current CAP was a good step? And what do you think are the benefits and the weaknesses of the way that it's currently designed? What's kind of your take in general?
Yes, thank you, Julia, for this question. I try to answer from the employer's point of view. And I have to start saying that agricultural employers are not opposed to the principle of social conditionality in the CAP. For the reason I mentioned in my statement. So we approach the social conditionality of as a tool to make the farmers that respect the rules be competitive. So it is important for us. It is our interest also, as you said, as a social partner. So we really trust that the social conditionality could implement all these aspects. We belong to a kind of agriculture, I mean about European agriculture, that is characterized by quality, by productive excellence product. So, which also means the quality of work, the quality of workers, the quality of possibilities that we gave to the workers. So on this ground, I think that we can compete with the rest of the world at the moment. So the benefits are those that I mentioned. And the point of weaknesses and concern regards and concern two aspects. The one is the practical implementation that will take place in all the countries. And the fact is objective, that the impact assessment and the evaluation, the rendezvous evaluation of the social conditionality in the new CAP will take place no earlier than 2026. So this means, which means that it will be very difficult before that time, that is very, very a long time and very far. It will be very difficult before that date, that it's also close to the new CAP, to approve any improvements or correction if this is necessary to achieve, to reach the objectives. So I can say the both things. From one side, the social conditionality is a really big opportunity. From the other side, I have to say, we have to monitor and be very careful about what in this phase of application, different application. Italy is one of the countries that choose to implement the social conditionality starting from 2023, also with Austria and with France, but there are main countries that decided different timings. So I think that the role of social partner like JELPA and like EFA2, it will be in this time to be very strictly monitoring how the different countries implement the application of the CAP, of the social conditionality. This is important to achieve the objectives and not to avoid the CAP.
Thanks. Also, interesting point you mentioned about the kind of timeline. If countries don't go beyond what's required and only implement in 2025, it doesn't indeed not leave a lot of time before the next CAP. So, and I know farmers always talk about planning security and kind of having a long-term vision for where things are going legislatively. So, indeed, an interesting point. So, Christian, maybe let's hear a bit from the other side. You already mentioned social conditionality, a step in the right direction. Where do you see some advantages and drawbacks, maybe?
So, I mean, just to mention, clearly social conditionality has been a long-standing demand of ours. For over 10 years, we've been discussing social conditionality within the Common Agricultural Policy. So for us, it was clearly a great victory. But nevertheless, this is just the first step in the right direction. There are still some weaknesses and drawbacks that needs to be addressed. Margaret mentioned earlier the scope of the directive. It doesn't kind of like cover the whole sector. This is something that needs to kind of like be looked into. But it's also the fact that, and we see it as a possible weakness, is that the mechanism to enforce and control the social conditionality are relying on existing checks and controls in the member states. And there we already know that there are many difficulties. The labor inspectorates in many of the member states are poorly funded and don't really have the capacity to follow up on this in the way we would like to see it. But this is, of course, something that needs to be addressed. And we have already put forward some ideas on how to implement minimum standards within the EU on labor inspectorates and so on. But overall, I think, as Claudia mentioned earlier, the role of the social partners needs to be better implemented into the CAP as well, and to follow up on the social conditionality cannot really be done without a very close consultation with both the European social partners, but also the social partners on a national level.
Yeah, thanks. Some interesting points already. I think we can go into some of them in a bit more detail throughout the discussion. I just wanted to frame a bit the discussion generally. Maybe Marie-Angels, you could tell us a bit about when we look at the agriculture sector and at working conditions, what are maybe some of the specificities that policymakers should keep in mind compared to other sectors when we're making policies for working conditions in this sector? And do you think that the social conditionality has been well designed and well adapted to this? What would you say?
Yes, basically on the social conditionality, I have to say I'm not really an expert, so I couldn't, provide informed, advice. It may be also a bit too early, I was thinking, to draw conclusions about successes and failures, and I think it's already been mentioned that now close monitoring and evaluation is going to be needed in the coming years to draw some conclusions. But I think a couple of things that that the previous speakers were mentioning. One was on the involvement of the social partners when it comes to the monitoring and evaluation of these measures. So we really would strongly support. I mean, there is evidence that whenever there is a measure that has tripartite consensus, I mean, whether it's social conditionality, whether it's education and training, when there is tripartite involvement, it is more successful. And then the other point is about the key role that I was mentioning at the beginning of labor market institutions and the important role of labor inspection. That, of course, that it's been mentioned, it's extremely weak in developing countries. Sometimes it's non-existent or very weak, and this is a big challenge that the sector has. So besides, I mean, social conditionality is definitely not the only answer. And in order to implement it successfully, it's very important to strengthen labor inspection. It's interesting, I mean, globally, there are 30 different conventions, international labor standards, touching the agricultural sector. And one of them is actually on labor inspection in agriculture. And it's actually one of the less ratified conventions in the ILO. I mean, this doesn't touch so much Europe, but just to say how important labor inspection is for the sector. And on your questions about the main decent work deficits in agriculture, it's, again, it's basically where the poorest of the poorest live. It's where informality is the highest. So, I mean, if I would have to summarize it in one, of course, it's, that are extremely high levels of informality. And I was looking at ILO data, and actually I think it's for EU, for the European Union, of the 10 sectors most represented, basically agriculture is the most represented sector in the informal economy in the European Union. So I would say, and with informality comes, of course, very low wages, poor working conditions, occupational safety and health. It's a huge challenge, and I have to say that we have in the ILO what we call the fundamental principles and rights at work. And since last year, basically, we have now occupational safety and health. The two occupational safety and health conventions are fundamental principle and rights at work. That meaning that member states, whether they have ratified or not ratified, they have to implement these conventions. So yes, I mean, the decent work deficits are, I mean, there are many depending on countries. I mean, gender inequalities are, the gender wage gap is very high in, for example, particularly in developing countries. So yes, I mean, there are many decent work deficits, I would say.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned something that we've heard mentioned a few times now, which is kind of the monitoring and the checks, which I'd say is something that this whole concept kind of hinges on. So, Roscoe, maybe you want to address this. Are you optimistic that it can be done, relying on member states' monitoring systems, that it can be effective in actually monitoring these standards that firms are supposed to comply with under social conditionality? Do you think this is a problem?
Yeah, thank you. So yes, as it was already mentioned, so in the previous CAP, subsidies were particularly conditional on respect for basic environmental standards, public health and animal welfare, while compliance with human and labor rights was not considered at all. This is why the previous CAP has failed to improve agriculture workers' conditions. As I said, yes, the European Economic and Social Committee is not a section which is related to environmental and agricultural issues. In the visited countries for an evaluation report, had the answers, the following answers. So respondents and workers' organizations strongly highlighted the importance of social conditionality, which should be a key to ensure decent working conditions for all. The ESC therefore welcomes the social conditionality in the current Common Agricultural Policy that links CAP subsidies to compliance with social and labor standards. It means that Common Agriculture Policy payments are linked to the respect of certain EU labor standards, and beneficiaries are incentivized to improve working conditions on farms. Social conditionality aims to make the CAP fairer and more sustainable as well. And allow me to say something personal. So actually, my country, Hungary, at the beginning, was not so open, and I'm very happy to see that and to hear that you, dear colleagues, you just put the stress on the social partners' role in this case. I think it's very, very important. Thanks to EFAT, we had the opportunity to try to speak with government and the Agriculture Ministry on how to proceed in this regard. And I have to say that this improved as well our role, because at national level, I am working for agricultural workers, so actually for trade union. And with the social conditionality issue, we just were engaged in the, let's say, policy making as well, which is quite important to say what is wrong and what should be improved. And I am very happy for that. And there is another point I would like to stress on is that regarding, for example, the very, not stylish, but the very, very, so the rural development issue itself, actually, we just recognize the fact that if we've got structured, improved, or let's say organized industrial relations, with this, we can attract back people, young people, to the rural areas to live and to work. So this is very important. And I truly believe that industrial relations can be improved only if we've got certain social conditionality issues to be, or rules to take into consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you also for your impressions from Hungary. Very interesting. Margaret, do you maybe also want to comment on this point of monitoring rules in the different member states, and maybe to phrase it a bit, maybe provocatively, should this even be something that's done within the CAP, if it's something that only member states can do, and that's kind of a prerogative of of national states in the EU, labor laws and their enforcement? Does it even make sense to have this as part of the cap?
Well, it wasn't part of the cap, and there was a big demand that it be part of the cap. I think a lot of people didn't see why public money was being paid to farmers who were abusing rules, and we know that this is a small percentage of the farmers, but still it gives a very, very bad view of the cap to have direct payments going to farmers who are, as I say, abusing their workers' rights. Now, just to explain why we selected the mechanism that we did. We wouldn't ask labour inspectors to go out and do the on-farm controls for the cap. We wouldn't ask them to measure agricultural parcels. We wouldn't ask them to do veterinary controls. We wouldn't ask them to do agri-environment controls. So therefore, we shouldn't ask agriculture inspectors to go and do labour controls. They're quite specialised, and therefore they have to be carried out by the competent labour authorities. So we have to rely on the controls that are there, that systems that are there. Now, one of the problems, or not so much a problem, but one of the constraints within the social legislation is that the treaty gives the competence for this to the member states. The Commission is allowed to frame directives which set a framework for the social and the labour rules, but or legislation, but there is very little enforcement prescribed in that legislation. They basically just say member states shall enforce, and they have very, very different ways of doing this. Some do it by carrying out controls, but there's no specification on the frequency of controls. Some do it via their social partners, and this can work extremely well in factories, for example, where the labour representative will insist that the workers stop work if the conditions aren't right, and also in some countries it has worked very well via information campaigns. To inform farmers a bit better, for example, or workers generally about proper working conditions. So there are very, very different ways in which this is done across the member states, and member states were very insistent that we don't interfere in how this is done. They say it's a very delicate balance between the social partners and that agriculture should not interfere in this. So therefore, we decided we would go with the systems that are in place. And of course, social conditionality is only going to be as good as those systems are. If controls aren't carried out, then there will be no penalties under the social conditionality mechanism. So, and I see Christian nodding to this. And of course, I mean, this is one of the big drawbacks of the social conditionality mechanism as it stands, but we do hope that it will raise awareness, that it will perhaps make the labour authority sit up and think, maybe we need to do a bit more in this area. I mean, one of the problems that they have for carrying out controls on the agriculture side is that, instead of going to one big factory or a big construction site and covering a lot of workers, you have to go to lots of individual farms. Many of them are very small, they're very remote. So in terms of economies of scale, it's very difficult for a labour authority to show this in their statistics as being work which is carried out. So I think one of the speakers, I think it was Christian, mentioned that the labour authorities are poorly funded and often understaffed. And I don't know, because this is not within my remit, but I don't doubt you on this at all. But I would also like to point out that there are within but because of all of the different types of work, you've got the informal work, you have the migrant work, you have the seasonal work. It makes it very hard for the sector to organize itself. The seasonal workers are constantly changing. The informal workers are invisible. They have no status. They have no standing. We have no idea what's going on, and nor do the authorities, because these people simply aren't registered as working. So it is very, very difficult to regularize this. But I would say that the legislation that we've included under social conditionality, the transparent and predictable working conditions, this applies to any employment relationship. So even if your worker is informal, or if he's a seasonal worker, you have an employment relationship with them. And I do think there's scope, if the member states really want to push the legislation, to try and improve the situation there for those workers. Also for occupational safety and health. You know, if you have any workers on your farm at all, also for your family members, occupational safety and health is a win-win for everyone, including the farmer, because there are so many accidents on farms. It helps everyone if you ensure better safety on farms. So I think those are just the few points I would like to say on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Christian, maybe to ask you, Margaret mentioned this hope that including standards into the CAP could also encourage national authorities to maybe ramp up checks on farms or to pay more attention to this issue. And I've heard a similar argument made for other parts of the CAP, like agro-environmental standards or veterinary standards, that people say sometimes these are standards that already exist, that are being incorporated into the CAP, but it means that it encourages checks to actually be done that weren't done before. Do you have this hope for the social conditionality?
I mean, it's a very complex issue in general when it comes to labor inspectorates. It's not something that only applies to the CAP. I mean, like, this is clearly that it applies to the whole labor market in general. And the agriculture sector is very specific in that sense. We all have other sectors within EFAT as well, which are very much based on small and micro-sized companies. It's more difficult to do labor inspector controls in those kind of companies. It's more time consuming and it requires more resources. In that sense, we believe that, as I said earlier, I mean, the authorities that we have already in the member states, and it has been not only mentioned by me, it was also mentioned by our colleague Mariangela, the resources and the standards are too weak. We need to have a stronger standards. And I believe that even though the labor inspections are a national competency, the EU can set minimum standards that the countries should follow. And then we can use the current and existing system that is in place already. But we also believe that there are other elements that need to be addressed as well. We believe that cross-checking between different enforcement agencies would be one of the elements. For example, cross-checking social security authorities, CAP paying agencies, tax authorities, and so on. Today, this is not a possibility, and we believe that this might also be something that needs to be looked into. And then finally, Margareta mentioned information. We clearly believe information is extremely important here, especially when we're talking about informal workers, and we have seasonal workers. It's people that come into the country for a very short period of time. We have been working closely with GEOPA and others to strengthen this element, and we believe that this is something that we need to continue to work on. I believe that the CAP should address this as well. There should be some funding set aside for the social partners, both at national level, but also on European level, to work on this topic. Because if we do so, we eliminate some of the issues by strengthening information. We just recently launched a new Season at Work application, which is an information app that is funded by the European Commission. And it is giving seasonal workers a tool in a very simple way to understand the basic rights that they have when moving from one country to another in their own language. And I think we need to be creative and work together, the social partners with the Commission, to find ways to improve information towards the workers so they also understand what are their rights and duties for the future.
Claudia, maybe let's hear from you next to hear a bit the employer's perspective. We talked about how feasible is the implementation in terms of controls, but how feasible do you think is the implementation of the social conditionality on the side of farmers? You already talked a bit about it in your introductory statement, but yeah, is this something that farmers will be able to implement, or is it asking too much of them?
Yes, thank you, Julia. So about the flexibility of the system. We all know that the CAP framework regulation has imposed the principle of social conditionality without providing for the concrete modality of the implementation. That could be a good thing or a bad thing. I think that this work delegated to the member states, and it takes some risk leading to maybe significant disparities between countries with different sanctions, with different controls and diligence. Therefore, I have to say, from the point of view of farmers, of the agricultural sector in this case, therefore it is evident for me that there must be a flexibility. This aspect could be only a problem. The different way to approach the application of social conditionality are in somehow intrinsic to the fact that the agricultural system of European Union are different. The member countries are different. The agricultural territory are different. Agriculture is not the same and cannot be the same. For example, if I think about Italy, or if I think about Sweden or Austria, there can be no remedy for flexibility because it represents a positive and distinctive factor. But we have to say precisely for this reason, it is important that there is an adequate monitoring from the social partner and from the Commission together to prevent that flexibility from turning into a positive factor, into a negative factor that can distort the competition. So this is my point of view. And the other good thing that the social conditionality in the new CAP can help to reach is about the monitoring system and data system. The data and monitoring system is an aspect that can improve really very much with social conditionality. I could take, if you give me just 1 second, a very practical example. For example, in my country, about Italy, that it is also one of the main concerns about the first application of social conditionality. And as you know, the operational aspect of the social conditionality, it regards the first step. Step 1 is the labor authorities, as you well know. The labor authorities in each member states inform the agricultural pay agency once a year about the case of non-compliance. This is first step. 2 step, the paying agency apply a reduction to the farmer payments when there is a labor or worker safety breach, and breach is identified. So those are the 2 steps. So, for example, in Italy, both the labor authorities data center and also the paying agency data center are not yet harmonized. They don't communicate each other. So we still have, at least at the moment, 3 different authorities that are in charge of controls on labor legislation and that do not communicate, and a payment system that is famous, I have to say, for the delays on the payment. So I think, and I really hope, that the social conditionality will be a stimulus to improve the functioning of our administrative machine. If it has not this capacity, we really fear, we are really very concerned in what will be the social conditionality application for the small farmers, for the administrative burden, for the family farmers and the small agricultural companies. So this is the point of view of farmers. We need flexibility. Flexibility could be positive, but have to be managed, have to be handled. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, an interesting point as well. The flexibility is being left to member states in this kind of construct. Maybe we can talk a bit more about it in a minute. I just wanted to take two questions from the chat that I think Margaret can both answer well. So there's one from Juan Molinero Gerbo from the Institute of Migrations at Comillas University. And the question is, can you please explain which are the sectors covered by social conditionality? I heard horticulture, fruits and vegetables are not covered by it, and this is a crucial aspect. So I know you mentioned in your introductory statement, so maybe you can elaborate a bit more on this point. And the second question is, how will this measure be implemented for small and medium-sized farms, where most of the workers are family members who are often not socially insured? Yeah, so maybe you could address these points, Margaret.
Okay, thank you. So basically social conditionality will apply, as is the case for the agricultural conditionality or environmental conditionality. It will apply to farmers who receive direct payments. So basically, farmers, it's area based. So any farmer who received direct payments will be subject to social conditionality. In the case of fruit and vegetables, they're inclined to receive their CAP money through the operational programs, and it's the same for wine, and I think also some of the animal sectors don't get a particular area aid. So those sectors are pretty much left out from social conditionality, and we didn't have a solution for that at the time. The social conditionality mechanism came along very late in terms of the CAP negotiation timeline. So we had a huge amount of work to do in screening all of the legislation that might be or could be applicable and could be useful to introduce. And we did not have time to look into how we could apply a mechanism to other sectors. Now I have some ideas. But I will not go into those because I haven't, I have to discuss all of those with my colleagues, and we have to see will they work. But I have some ideas for how we could possibly introduce a mechanism into fruit and vegetables. I also have ideas about other legislation that could be included in the future. We do have under the operational programs for fruit and vegetables and wine, we do have objectives now on ensuring good employment conditions. And it is possible to have interventions that would help in improving the conditions. But there's no mechanism for penalising the farmers concerned at this stage. But it's something we will look at for the next CAP. And then as far as the small and medium farmers are concerned who have family workers on the farm, indeed, that is an issue. I mean, they're in a way, they're informal workers. And I know that the incidence of child death and injury on farms is extremely high. It's quite shocking. It's really it's something that a lot of member states are concerned about already. But if you have occupational safety and health rules applied on farms, then they also apply to the family members. So even if a farmer doesn't have workers that he's paying for or paying a proper or regular wage to, a farmer could and should still introduce proper occupational safety and health rules on the farm to ensure their own safety as a farmer, but also the safety of family members and any occasional or informal workers that they would have as well.
Yeah, thank you for replying to the questions. Maybe now let's come back to this point of national flexibility. So Christian, maybe let's hear from you. One crucial thing that's left up to member states in the system is the sanctions. So how much of the subsidies are withheld if a farm doesn't comply with the standards? Do you think this is a good thing, leaving this up to member states, or should there be stricter rules on the EU level?
First of all, just to kind of reply a little bit to what Claudia mentioned earlier. I mean, we do not believe that social conditionality is a burden on farmers themselves, because we are only talking about complying to existing controls and existing labor standards. We're not talking about new ones. The legal requirement already exists, and it's only a matter of not giving money to those farmers and employers that do not follow the law that is existing in those countries. The new CAP obliges member states to impose administrative sanctions by means of reduction of exclusion of the total amount of the payments to those employers not respecting a given set of EU labor standards. And we already hear in the discussion that our affiliates are having in those 4 countries already mentioned, that the level of sanction that is being proposed is extremely low, and something that we believe is not really dissuasive enough for this to really work. And this is a concern of ours, that the flexibility and the implementation at a member state level might create problems. And therefore, we have a clear demand, and we have put forward some proposal on how to address this, which our affiliates are putting forward at the national level. But we also believe that even though the national governments are working with this, we believe that the Commission should engage not only with the member states, but also with the European social partners to develop a coordinated and effective sanctioning system across whole of Europe, and try to harmonize the sanction systems for future purposes and future use.
Thank you. Just because you already mentioned this question of reusing standards that already exist in the CAP, or is it an extra burden? There's a related question in the chat, so maybe I'll just have you answer it as well, since you already raised the topic. So the question is, how will the risk of double punishment be eliminated when the existing national framework is already very strict and labor authorities control the farmers? Social conditionality within the CAP is just additional pressure on farms and administrative burden, someone in the chat said. So how would you reply to this?
I mean, once again, I mean, like following law is not an administrative burden. I mean, just to start with that point, I mean, like nobody should see it as an administrative burden to follow the law that is existing in member states. Whether it's a double punishment, I think everybody agree that double punishment should not exist. But nevertheless, I mean, like, what is a double punishment? Are we, in most cases, there is no punishment taking place in breaching labor standards in most European countries, or it's minimum. So in that sense, I don't see this as a major issue, but I understand that this is something that is it should just be an additional, I mean, the social condition should be an additional encouragement to the farmers and the employers to follow the existing labor standards.
Okay, maybe let's talk about another point that was already raised a couple of times, which is that there's many workers in informal employment in the agriculture sector. So Marie-Angels, maybe you could address a bit what do policies need to keep in mind, or what do policymakers need to keep in mind to kind of address this situation? What policies do we need to help improve the situation of informal workers?
Yes, so I think that, I mean, as already has been mentioned, addressing informality, it's basically, I mean, it's not about a policy intervention, but it is about multiple interventions and following, I mean, what we call an integrated policy framework. We have an international labor standard on informality, which is our recommendation. It's not a convention, but it's a recommendation 204, and it's got a long list of issues that they need to be addressed to tackle informality, that range from access to education, lifelong learning, access to markets, access to finance, the promotion of a conducive business environment, the importance of the regulatory and legislative framework, I mean, the importance of labor inspection, as we've been talking about, and also, the promotion of and the elimination of all forms of discrimination and also violence and harassment. There is a convention on violence and harassment, and that's also, I mean, an important issue that touches the sector. But maybe from all this integrated policy framework that we talk about, this recommendation, I would say that a very important measure for addressing informality is the extension of social protection. So basically extending social security to informal economic workers. It's basically crucial, I believe, to address informality. But there is not one single measure. I mean, countries are different, and we need to think about a whole comprehensive package of policies. Also, very important to target these small and medium-sized enterprises that we were talking about, which is basically where a lot of agriculture workers work.
Maybe Margaret, to turn to you, the other kind of characteristic of the sector that we mentioned was that there are many migrant workers as well, including within the EU. So I was just wondering, does this mean there's an increased risk for workers to kind of slip through the cracks of national systems? And is this something the EU can address by taking the matter into its own hands?
Oh, well, okay. I hold up something on the screen, and this is Piroska will recognize this because I think she's going to speak about it on Wednesday, and I will be there also. And this is a report that the Economic and Social Committee has come out with on collecting data on the situation of social protection of seasonal workers. And there she has some recommendations which I think could really help. One of them is establishing the regular and digital collection of administrative information on employment contracts used to hire EU citizens for seasonal work. And there are other things mentioned in that as well. I started to read it yesterday. I still have to finish reading it by Wednesday. But it looks like it collects a lot of very, very useful information. And that's the problem. We don't have the information. As I said, the informal workers are invisible. A lot of the migrant workers are invisible. And for third country workers, there's already really strong legislation on this, which puts very draconian penalties on employers who abuse workers who are legally employed as third country migrant workers. But there's the whole illegal sector, and that's where so much of the abuse is going on. I mean, I think we have I think someone mentioned the equal or the minimum wage directive. So if everyone had a minimum wage, then there would be much less, of course, of all of the abuses that take place. Maybe there would be much less informal work because people would be paid a proper wage and they'd be willing to pay tax and social security contributions. The reason why the whole sector is informal is so that farmers and agribusiness and those other sectors as well, so that they can get away with paying their workers very, very small wages. So I think this is something that really we have to try and do something about. But it's very difficult. As I said, it's an invisible sector. Just to go back to the point that you made on the sanctions and on the administrative burden, I don't agree that it's not an administrative burden on farmers. It is an administrative burden in the same way that all of the animal welfare legislation and all of the environmental legislation is a burden on farmers. And when I used to be an auditor, and when you go out to the farms and talk to the farmers, this is what they say. It's trying to ensure that they respect all of this legislation. Is a huge burden, and it requires a lot of paperwork, and it's a lot of stress. So this is something we had to very much take in mind when we applied social conditionality. We can't constantly burden farmers, and when we do burden them, we have to do it gradually. And this is why social conditionality starts small. And the other thing is on double sanction. It's not a sanction because it's taking a reduction of a payment. So, formally speaking, it's not a sanction. But this is also one of the reasons why when we hear complaints that some of the sanctions applied by the national authorities are low. We don't want to go and put a very high bar at EU level. It's the only sector where they're going to have a labour sanction plus have income reduced. And why should the agriculture sector be the one that is doubly penalised? And so this is one of the reasons why we don't want to be too prescriptive on what member states do. It's early days, as Christian said, only 4 member states. You didn't mention Luxembourg, but it's also introduced social conditionality this year. Portugal and Spain will do so next year. And this autumn, we will start looking at the systems in place in the 4 member states who have already introduced social conditionality. Next year, we will look at the other 2. And if we do find that there is a real problem with the sanction systems in place, we will consider introducing legislation on it. But we will not do this until we see that there is a problem. And we will be doing a study next year and a study in a couple of years' time that will look into this. Thank you.
Prosper, maybe since Margaret mentioned your report, do you want to give us a little sneak peek, like 1 or 2 key points that you'd like to share already before Wednesday?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you, Margaret, for mentioning this as well. Yes, actually, I just would like to stress, I would like to put the stress on 3 points, what we already can say that about problems we faced or which were challenging. So the first problem was already mentioned, was the information on seasonal workers, which is it's lacking. So in the EU, so it's very fragmented and complex and presents many gaps indeed. So when in mid-July 2020, the European Commission issued the guidelines on seasonal workers in the EU, in the context of the COVID-19 outbreak, the number of these workers was estimated to be per year between several 100,000 and 1 million. So this is from the Eurofund webpage statistics. So in March 2021, a study by the European Commission estimated the number of intra-EU seasonal workers in the agriculture, forestry, fishing, accommodation, and food services sectors between 650,000 and 850,000. So it's very difficult. And how can we properly reach all seasonal workers if we struggle to know how many workers we are talking about? So there is a lack of European statistics on EU seasonal workers indeed, and the statistics on non-EU seasonal workers are fragmented, as I said. Okay, but I don't want to be very long. So a second challenge is that different pieces of EU legislation apply to seasonal workers depending on their nationality. According to the fundamental right to the free movement of workers within the EU citizens are entitled to be treated as the nationals of the host countries as regards employment, remuneration, and other conditions of work and employment. So I think this is another point to be put in highlight, and actually, there were many others which I don't want to speak about, but I think it's it's going to be quite an important study on seasonal and migrant workers as well, taking into considerations ILO's conventions as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the preview. Claudia, I wanted to come back with you on a point that you briefly mentioned, I think, during your introductory statement, which is the question of competitiveness. So if we raise labor standards or apply strict labor standards, enforce them, is this going to threaten the international competitiveness of the European agriculture sector? Is this something you're worried about?
Okay, thank you, Julia. The first things that I mentioned in my statement, it was about the situation of agriculture that is really concerned us. We think about the implementation and the increasing of the cost and the effect of the crisis, Russia-Ukraine, that is very concerned all the raw material that we need to produce food, and this is one kind of the problem. And the second part of the problem that really concerns us about the future of agriculture, it regards the question of climate changes, that everybody talks about that, but sometimes we forget that the farmers and the agricultural sector are the first victims of the climate changes. So this is a really very big question that we have to approach, and we have to be serious about that, but because it really can compromise the capacity of production of our agriculture. If I think about what happened in Emilia-Romagna, is one of the main agricultural region in our country, that we have, I think that everybody heard about that. We have a very critic flood that compromised all the horticulture and fruit and vegetable production. That is not only a regional problem, but it's a national problem. So we have to face about that. And I think that we have to face in two different ways. One is to make to enforce the social protection for the farmers and for the workers, because is it obvious that if I have a problem like the flood in the end of the May in the main region of agricultural production, how can I guarantee the work for my workers? This is one point that we have to face. And I think also that technologies can really help us to approach this problem. Talking about what you asked about the competitiveness of our agriculture, that really regards this aspect. So we have to approach the question in a very wide way. So climate changes and the problem of prices and the problem of how can we be competitive with non-EU countries that have know the same cost, that have known the same concern of us. We're talking about social conditionality. Today, it is important that European Union can demonstrate to be the first in this field, but we have to know, and we know that the rest of agricultural countries that are not EU countries have other approach, other problems. So it's a really big problem of competitiveness. So this means that if we want to reach the objective of strengthen the application, we really have to involve all the main actors that are also in this panel join. So it means the Commission, it means the social partner, it means a very good balance between the public and private policies. So if we make a system on starting also from a point like the social conditionality, and not approach the social conditionality as one point separate to all the problems of the agriculture. If we are all responsible about this kind of approach, I think that we really could be very competitive. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maybe very briefly, because we're running out of time, but just to wrap up, Mary Angels, would you want to come in on that point as well? I just wanted to give the floor to you for a second. Oh, you disappeared. Can others still see her? Are you still there, Mary Angels? All right. Maybe not then. But we're also running out of time anyway, so... you're back. Okay. Can you hear me, Mary-Angeles? Oh. Okay. Okay, maybe we just wrap it up since I think there's some technical problems, but we're also almost out of time. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. But I thank you all for being here. I thank the panelists for the very lively and informative discussion, and also everyone in the audience for your questions in the chat and for your interest. And of course, if you want to learn more about all things CAP reform, all things social conditionality, stay tuned on euractiv.com. And we hope to see you next time at our next event. Have a good day.